She vanished without a single word. 6 months pregnant, leaving behind nothing but an empty closet and a phone number that would never ring again. 6 years later, the same man who once tore a city apart searching for her would walk into a hospital corridor and find her hands buried inside his son's chest, the only person standing between his child and death. He didn't recognize her voice at first. He recognized her hands. Those steady, precise hands that had once traced his jawline in the dark of a penthouse he no longer lived in. Now moving with brutal calm over a crash cart, calling out numbers to a trauma team while his 6-year-old son's heart stopped beating on the table in front of her. He would spend the rest of his life trying to understand how the woman he had once accused of betrayal had actually been the one saving lives in the shadows he never bothered to look into. And by the time he understood the truth, he would realize that the 6 years he spent hating her were 6 years he could never get back. This is the story of Adrian Cole, a man who built one of the largest private equity firms on the East Coast, and Naomi Reyes, the woman who disappeared from his life the same week he was supposed to become a father, and the devastating truth neither of them saw coming until it was almost too late. To understand what happened in that hospital corridor, you have to go back 7 years, to a rooftop bar in Boston where Adrian Cole first noticed a woman who wasn't impressed by anything about him. He was 29 then, 3 years into building Cole Ventures from a converted studio apartment into a firm that had just closed its first $100 million fund. He was used to rooms tilting toward him the moment he walked in, used to people laughing a beat too hard at things that weren't especially funny, used to being the most interesting person in any conversation simply because of the number attached to his name. Naomi Reyes was a third-year emergency medicine resident who had come to the rooftop bar for exactly one drink between back-to-back 30-hour shifts, and she made it clear within the first 5 minutes that she had absolutely no idea who he was and even less interest in finding out. "You keep looking at me like you're waiting for me to ask what you do," she said, not unkindly, stirring the ice in her glass. "I'm not going to ask." "Why not?" "Because in my experience, the men who most want to be asked that question are the ones whose answer is the least interesting thing about them." Adrian laughed, genuinely, for the first time in longer than he could remember. He was so used to being valued for his balance sheet that he'd forgotten what it felt like to be looked at as a person rather than an opportunity. They talked for 4 hours that night about nothing related to money at all. About her decision to specialize in emergency medicine because she wanted the kind of work where you either save someone or you didn't, no ambiguity, no spin. About his complicated relationship with a father who'd built an empire out of steel manufacturing, and never once told his son he was proud of him. By the time the bar closed, Adrian Cole, a man who structured billion-dollar acquisitions for a living, was the one who felt like he'd just lost every advantage he usually walked into a room with, and he'd never felt more relieved to lose. For the first year it was, by every account from the people who knew them both, the happiest anyone had ever seen him. Naomi didn't move into his world so much as pull him gently into hers, teaching him to sit in hospital cafeterias at 3 in the morning without complaining, showing him that the version of himself who laughed easily and asked more questions than he answered was the version worth being. His mother, Diane Cole, adored her instantly. "She's the first person who's ever looked at my son like his money was an inconvenience rather than an invitation," Diane told a friend at the time, a comment that would later become almost unbearably ironic given everything that followed. The one person who did not adore Naomi Reyes was Adrian's father, Frederick Cole. Frederick had built Cole Steel from nothing, and he measured every person who entered his son's orbit by a single brutally simple metric. What do they bring to the family's position? A brilliant, driven, entirely self-made emergency room doctor should, by most reasonable measures, have scored well on that metric. But Frederick Cole did not see a woman with an extraordinary career. He saw a woman with no family name, no inherited wealth, and no interest whatsoever in being shaped into the kind of wife who could be photographed at the right galas making the right small talk with the right people. "She'll slow you down," Frederick told Adrian bluntly, over a dinner Naomi hadn't been invited to. "A woman like that has her own ambitions. She won't fold herself around yours. You need someone who understands that your career comes first, not someone competing for the same 24 hours in a day." Adrian, to his credit, dismissed the comment at the time. He proposed to Naomi 18 months after that rooftop conversation, on a beach in Portugal, with a ring he'd spent 3 months choosing without a single input from his father's opinion. Naomi said yes through tears that had nothing to do with performance and everything to do with genuine disbelief that this particular life had found her. They married the following spring in a ceremony smaller and quieter than anything the Cole family's social circle expected, exactly the way Naomi wanted it, and exactly the way Adrian discovered he wanted it too, once he stopped assuming his father's preferences were his own. For nearly 2 years, the marriage flourished in a way that made even the skeptics reconsider their doubts. Naomi finished her residency and joined the trauma department at Boston General, working brutal hours she never once resented, coming home some nights so exhausted she fell asleep still in her scrubs, and Adrian learned to love her most in exactly those unglamorous, unphotographed moments. Then, 6 years before the night in the hospital corridor, Naomi found out she was pregnant. She told Adrian on a Tuesday morning, holding the test with hands that were shaking for the first time either of them could remember, and he picked her up off the ground and spun her around their kitchen like something out of a film neither of them would normally have admitted to enjoying. For exactly 11 days, it was the purest kind of happiness either of them had ever experienced. On the 12th day, everything began to unravel, and it began with a woman neither of them had ever met. Her name was Priya Malhotra, and she worked as an executive assistant in Cole Ventures' Investor Relations division, a role she had held for exactly 4 months before she walked into Adrian's office, closed the door, and told him she was pregnant with his child. Adrian, to his eternal credit in this particular part of the story, told her flatly and immediately that this was impossible, that he had never so much as had a private conversation with her outside of scheduled meetings, that whatever she was attempting, it wasn't going to work. He asked HR to investigate immediately. He told Naomi everything that same evening unprompted, before anyone else could get to her first. What he did not yet understand, what none of them understood for another 5 agonizing weeks, was that Priya Malhotra had been placed at Cole Ventures for exactly this purpose, and she had not acted alone. Frederick Cole, still convinced that Naomi represented a liability to the family's long-term position, and increasingly desperate as his son's marriage grew stronger rather than weaker under his disapproval, had spent months quietly orchestrating a plan designed to end it. He had personally arranged Priya's hiring through a shell recruiting firm. He had fabricated a trail of doctored calendar entries, forged hotel confirmations, and coached testimony designed to make the affair appear not just plausible but airtight, all timed to detonate at the exact moment it would do the most damage, in the earliest, most fragile weeks of Naomi's pregnancy. Adrian didn't know any of this. He only knew that within days, fabricated evidence began appearing that made his denials sound increasingly hollow even to his own legal team. A hotel receipt with his corporate card number on it, for a night he could account for completely but couldn't yet prove. A string of texts from a burner phone registered under a name traced, falsely, back to one of his personal accounts. Photographs, carefully staged and manipulated, of Adrian and Priya together outside a restaurant he had genuinely visited that week, though not with her. Naomi, 6 weeks pregnant, hormonal in a way that made every fear feel like fact, and watching evidence accumulate against a man whose own father seemed strangely unbothered by it all, began to unravel in a way that terrified her. "Adrian, I want to believe you," she told him one night, sitting on the edge of their bed, unable to stop her hands from shaking. "I do. But there's so much of it. And your father keeps telling me privately that he's seen worse than this from you before, that this isn't unprecedented behavior." "He's lying to you," Adrian said, and he was right, though he had no way to prove it yet. "My father has never liked you, Naomi. I don't know why yet, but I think this is him." It was, in fact, exactly him. But Frederick Cole had spent 30 years building an empire on the principle of never leaving fingerprints, and the fabricated evidence was constructed with the same ruthless precision he applied to every hostile takeover he'd ever engineered. Adrian's legal team, working as fast as they could, was still weeks away from unraveling it. Naomi didn't have weeks. She had a pregnancy hormone-flooded nervous system, a father-in-law feeding her calculated doubt through carefully timed phone calls when Adrian wasn't present, and a stack of evidence that, taken at face value, painted a picture she couldn't unsee no matter how much she wanted to believe her husband. The final blow came from a source that made it, tragically, unimpeachable in her eyes. Diane Cole, Adrian's own mother, the woman who had adored Naomi from the very beginning, called her one evening in tears, saying she couldn't keep the secret any longer, that she'd seen something herself, that she was so sorry, so devastated, that her son could do this to someone she loved like a daughter. What Naomi didn't know, what Adrian himself wouldn't learn for years, was that Diane had been manipulated by Frederick just as thoroughly as everyone else, shown selectively edited surveillance footage, and told a story constructed specifically to break through the one relationship in Naomi's life that had nothing to do with romantic trust and everything to do with genuine familial love. Diane hadn't lied. She had simply been lied to with surgical precision by a man who had been managing her emotions for 30 years of marriage. Naomi packed a single suitcase that night. She left no note because she had tried 3 separate times to write one, and every version felt like it was begging for a response she was terrified she would receive and terrified she would believe. She changed her phone number the next morning. She requested an emergency transfer to a hospital system in another state through a colleague who owed her a favor, and asked no questions. She was gone by the end of the week, 6 weeks pregnant, carrying a secret she now believed was safer kept entirely to herself. Adrian searched for her for 8 months with an intensity that nearly cost him the company. He hired investigators. He drained personal accounts on leads that went nowhere. He eventually uncovered enough of his father's fabricated evidence to understand, with sickening clarity, exactly what had been done to his marriage, and the confrontation that followed permanently fractured his relationship with Frederick Cole in ways that never fully healed. But by the time Adrian understood the truth, Naomi had disappeared so completely, changed her name through a legal process facilitated by an attorney friend, moved across state lines, and rebuilt her entire professional identity from scratch, that even his considerable resources couldn't find a trace of her. Eventually, brutally, he had no choice but to accept that she was gone, and that whatever they had built together was gone with her. He never remarried. He built Cole Ventures into an even larger empire, in the specific, driven way that men sometimes channel grief into achievement because it's the only language their pain knows how to speak. And 3 years after Naomi disappeared, in a decision his friends still don't fully understand, he adopted a son. The boy's name was Eli, and he came to Adrian through a private domestic adoption after Adrian, in a rare moment of vulnerability with a therapist he'd finally agreed to see, admitted that the family he'd once imagined with Naomi had never stopped feeling unfinished, and that raising a child alone felt less impossible than continuing to live in a house built for 3 people that only ever held one. Eli was, by every account, the thing that finally pulled Adrian Cole out of the specific, controlled darkness he'd been operating inside since Naomi left. He learned to read bedtime stories in voices that made a 5-year-old shriek with laughter. He learned to sit through school plays where his son had exactly one line. He learned slowly, painfully, to let himself be happy again, in a smaller, quieter, entirely different way than the happiness he'd once had. He had no idea that 700 miles away, in a small coastal city in North Carolina, a woman who now went by the name Naomi Ellison had given birth to a daughter she named Grace, raised her entirely alone through years of 18-hour hospital shifts and a poverty of both money and sleep that would have broken most people, and had eventually clawed her way into a position as head of trauma medicine at Ashworth Regional, one of the most respected emergency departments on the eastern seaboard. He had no idea that his daughter existed at all. For 6 years, 2 entirely separate lives ran in parallel, never touching, until a rainy Thursday afternoon when Adrian Cole's driver lost control of his vehicle on a slick highway overpass, and 6-year-old Eli Cole was rushed by helicopter, unconscious and bleeding internally, to the only level 1 trauma center within range. Ashworth Regional. Adrian arrived at the hospital 40 minutes after the accident, having driven himself at speeds that should have gotten him arrested twice, his hands shaking so badly he could barely operate his own phone to call his lawyer, his mother, anyone who could tell him his son was going to be all right. He burst through the emergency department doors demanding answers from a receptionist who had clearly seen 1,000 terrified parents before him, and had learned to remain calm regardless. "Cole," he said, his voice cracking. "Eli Cole. 6 years old. He was in an accident. Where is he?" "Trauma Bay 3, the receptionist said, already gesturing toward a set of double doors. "Dr. Ellison is with him now. She's the best we have, sir. I promise you, your son is in extraordinary hands." Dr. Ellison. The name meant nothing to Adrian in that moment, drowned out entirely by the sound of his own pulse hammering in his ears as he pushed through the doors and into a scene that stopped him dead in the doorway. A trauma team surrounded a small, impossibly small, body on a table, monitors screaming in a rhythm that made Adrian's stomach drop through the floor. And at the center of it, calling out orders with a calm, commanding precision that cut through the chaos like a blade, was a woman with her dark hair pulled back severely from her face, blood on the sleeves of her scrubs, her hands moving with a speed and confidence that belonged to someone who had done this exact terrible dance 1,000 times before. "He's bradycardic, we're losing the airway, get me the crash cart now," she said, and something in the specific cadence of her voice, some frequency Adrian's body recognized before his mind caught up, made the floor tilt beneath him. She turned, just for a fraction of a second, to call an order to a nurse behind her, and Adrian Cole found himself staring directly into the face of a woman he had spent 6 years believing he would never see again. Naomi. For one suspended, impossible moment, their eyes met across the trauma bay, over the small broken body of a boy neither of them yet understood the full truth about, and Adrian watched something flicker across her face, recognition, shock, and beneath it, a flash of something that looked almost like fear. But she didn't stop. She didn't falter. Whatever she was feeling in that instant, she buried it with a professional discipline that Adrian would later understand had been forged through 6 years of exactly this kind of moment, and she turned back to his son, her hands steady, her voice unwavering, and she said, loud enough for the entire room to hear, "We are not losing this child. Everyone focus." Adrian stood frozen in the doorway, a security guard's hand gently but firmly on his shoulder guiding him back into the hallway where family members were required to wait, and he watched through a narrow window as the woman he had spent 6 years mourning fought, with everything she had, to save the life of the son he had built an entire second act of his life around, without either of them yet understanding that the boy on that table was connected to her in a way that would soon detonate every assumption both of them had built their lives on top of. The next 40 minutes were, Adrian would later say, the longest of his entire life. He paced a narrow hallway outside the trauma bay, unable to sit, unable to think clearly about anything except the sound of Naomi's voice cutting through his memory again and again, layered impossibly over the sound of monitors beeping somewhere behind a door he wasn't allowed through. When the doors finally opened, Naomi emerged still in bloodied scrubs, pulling off a pair of gloves with hands that, for the first time since Adrian had seen her, were trembling slightly. "He's stable," she said, and Adrian felt his knees nearly give out with relief. "We managed to control the internal bleeding. He's got a fractured rib, a moderate concussion, and he lost more blood than I'd like, but he's stable, Adrian. He's going to be okay." She said his name. Not Mr. Cole. Adrian. For a long moment, neither of them said anything else, the weight of 6 years and an entire unspoken history pressing down on the narrow hospital corridor between them. "Naomi," Adrian finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't understand. How are you here? I looked for you for 8 months. I hired people. I nearly lost everything looking for you, and now you're standing in front of me in a hospital, and you just saved my son's life, and I don't understand any of this." Something shifted in Naomi's expression. A complicated mixture of grief and guilt and 6 years of carefully constructed distance beginning, finally, to crack. "There's something you need to know," she said quietly, glancing around the busy corridor before gesturing toward a quieter alcove near the family consultation room. "And I think you should sit down before I tell you." Adrian didn't sit. He couldn't. But he followed her into the small room, closing the door behind them, bracing himself without knowing for what. "When I left," Naomi began, her voice steadier than she felt, "I was 6 weeks pregnant." The words landed in the small room like a physical blow. Adrian felt the air leave his lungs entirely. "What?" "I had your daughter, Adrian. I named her Grace. She's 5.5 years old, and she doesn't know anything about you, because I genuinely believed for 6 years that telling her about you would mean telling her about a father who had betrayed her mother before she was even born. I believed the evidence. I believed your father, and I believed your own mother, and by the time I understood how thoroughly I'd been manipulated, I had already rebuilt an entire life around the belief that going back would only bring more danger, not less." Adrian sat down then, hard, onto the small couch in the consultation room, his mind unable to process the scale of what he was hearing. A daughter. A 5-year-old daughter who had been alive, growing, existing, for her entire life without him knowing a single thing about her. The evidence. he said slowly, forcing the words out through a throat that felt like it was closing. Naomi, all of it was fabricated. My father built the entire thing. Priya Malhotra was planted at the company specifically to destroy us. He forged the hotel receipts. He manipulated my own mother into believing she'd seen something that never happened. I spent 8 months trying to prove it, and by the time I could prove it, you were gone so completely that even people I paid an enormous amount of money couldn't find you. Naomi's face went pale, the full weight of what she'd built her entire second life around beginning to buckle beneath the truth she'd never had access to. Your father, she said, her voice barely a whisper. It was your father the entire time. Every piece of it, Adrian confirmed, his own voice raw with an anger that had been dormant for years but was clearly nowhere near resolved. I confronted him. I nearly destroyed our entire relationship over it. He never fully admitted it, but I found enough to know beyond any doubt that he orchestrated the whole thing because he decided you weren't the right fit for the family's position. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the small room heavy with 6 years of grief neither had ever fully allowed themselves to process, because grief for something you believe was a betrayal is a different, more complicated animal than grief for something you know was stolen from you. I have a son, Adrian finally said, his voice thick. His name is Eli. I adopted him 3 years ago because I never stopped wanting the family we were supposed to have. And I thought I genuinely believed that I would never find you again, that this was the closest I would ever get. Naomi closed her eyes, tears finally breaking free and sliding silently down her face. The boy in there, she said. The boy I just spent 40 minutes fighting to save. That's your son. That's my son, Adrian confirmed. And somewhere right now is a daughter I've never met, who has no idea I exist, who is 5.5 years old and has spent her entire life believing her father either doesn't know she exists or didn't want to. She believes you didn't want either of us, Naomi said quietly, the admission clearly costing her something enormous. I never told her the details. I just told her that sometimes things don't work out between two people, and that it wasn't her fault, and that I loved her enough for 2 parents. I never told her you were unfaithful. I couldn't bring myself to say those words to a little girl about her own father, even when I believed them. But I let her believe by omission that you simply weren't in the picture by choice. Adrian put his head in his hands, the full architecture of 6 stolen years collapsing around him all at once, the son he had raised without knowing about the daughter he'd never met, the woman across from him who had spent 6 years believing a lie so thoroughly constructed it had reshaped the entire course of both their lives. I need to see her, he said finally, looking up, his eyes red but his voice steady with a determination Naomi remembered from a lifetime ago. Not to disrupt her life. Not to take anything from you. But I have missed 5.5 years of my daughter's life because of a lie my own father constructed, and I am not going to miss a single day more than I already have. Naomi studied him for a long moment, 6 years of careful protective distance warring visibly with the truth that had just fundamentally rearranged everything she believed about the last 6 years of her life. She's with my neighbor right now, Naomi said finally. I can call her. But Adrian, I need you to understand something. Grace is happy. She's secure. She's loved beyond measure. Whatever happens from here, I need it to happen slowly, carefully, in a way that protects her, not in a way that serves either of our need to make up for lost time all at once. I understand, Adrian said, and for the first time in 6 years, something in his chest that had been clenched shut since the day Naomi disappeared began, tentatively, to loosen. I have all the time in the world to do this right. I'm just done being on the outside of it. The following days unfolded with a delicacy that surprised even the 2 people navigating them. Eli, once stable and moved to a recovery room, spent his first waking hours with his father at his bedside and to Adrian's quiet astonishment, with Dr. Ellison checking in on him with a warmth that went beyond standard professional care, a warmth Adrian now understood came from a place neither of them had expected. Eli, 6 years old and utterly unbothered by the complicated adult architecture unfolding around him, took an immediate and enormous liking to the doctor who had saved his life, following her with wide-eyed fascination whenever she entered the room. Are you going to be my doctor forever? He asked her on the 3rd day, as she checked the monitors beside his bed. Naomi laughed, softer than Adrian had heard her laugh in 6 years. I don't think that's quite how it works, buddy. But I promise I'll always check in on you, as long as you're here. Adrian watched the exchange with an ache in his chest that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with the future. He was only beginning to allow himself to imagine. He met Grace for the first time 9 days after the accident in a quiet, carefully arranged meeting at a park near Naomi's home, deliberately framed to her as meeting a friend of her mother's, nothing more, nothing that would overwhelm a 5-year-old with a truth too large for her to process all at once. Grace, it turned out, had her mother's fierce, curious eyes and unmistakably Adrian's exact smile, a fact that hit him so hard the moment she grinned up at him over a shared bag of goldfish crackers that he had to excuse himself for a moment to compose himself behind a nearby tree. "Mommy says you're a very important businessman," Grace informed him solemnly in the direct, unfiltered way of 5-year-olds. "Do you know how to build a really good sandcastle, though? Because that's actually more important." "I happen to be an excellent sandcastle builder," Adrian told her, crouching down to her eye level, his voice thick with an emotion he was working hard to keep from overwhelming a child who had no idea what this moment actually meant. "Want to see?" For the next hour, Adrian Cole, founder and chairman of one of the largest private equity firms on the Eastern Seaboard, sat in the sand beside a daughter he'd known about for exactly 9 days, building a lopsided, thoroughly unimpressive castle that Grace declared, with fierce 5-year-old loyalty, to be the best one she'd ever seen. Naomi watched from a nearby bench, arms wrapped around herself, tears she didn't bother wiping away tracking silently down her face, watching 6 stolen years finally, imperfectly, begin to be reclaimed. The legal and emotional untangling that followed took months, not days. Adrian formally severed his professional and personal relationship with his father entirely, a rupture that made headlines in the business press and that Adrian, for the first time in his life, didn't care in the slightest about managing or softening. Frederick Cole, confronted with irrefutable evidence his son had spent years quietly accumulating, never offered anything resembling a genuine apology, only a cold, clipped acknowledgement that he'd done what he believed was necessary to protect the family's interests. A statement that told Adrian everything he needed to know about a relationship he finally allowed himself to walk away from completely. Diane Cole, when she learned the full truth of how thoroughly she had been manipulated into betraying the daughter-in-law she genuinely loved, was inconsolable for weeks, and it was, in a strange twist neither of them could have predicted, Naomi who ultimately extended forgiveness first, recognizing in Diane's devastation an echo of her own experience of being lied to with surgical precision by a man who had spent decades perfecting exactly that skill. Eli and Grace met for the first time 3 months after the accident, in a carefully arranged, gentle introduction that Naomi and Adrian planned together with the same collaborative precision Naomi once brought to a trauma bay. And the 2 children siblings who had spent their entire lives unaware the other existed, bonded within a single afternoon with the effortless, uncomplicated ease that only children seem capable of, building an entire fantastical kingdom out of couch cushions within an hour of meeting, as though some part of them had simply been waiting for the other to arrive. Adrian and Naomi's own path back to each other was slower, more careful, built not on the assumption that 6 years could simply be erased, but on the harder, more honest work of 2 people relearning each other as they'd each actually become, rather than who they'd been at 28 and 31. There were difficult conversations, nights where old grief resurfaced in ways neither expected, moments where Naomi had to work through a residual instinct toward self-protection that 6 years of surviving alone had carved deep into her, and moments where Adrian had to sit with the uncomfortable truth that his own father's cruelty had cost him not just a wife, but 5.5 years of a daughter's childhood he would never get back, no matter how completely he showed up for the years that remained. But slowly, deliberately, across a year that neither of them rushed, something real and durable began to rebuild itself between them, not a resumption of the life that had been stolen, but the construction of an entirely new one, informed by everything both of them had survived. 18 months after that rainy Thursday when a car accident brought 2 broken timelines crashing back together, Adrian Cole and Naomi Ellison, who reclaimed her married name only when she was ready and on her own terms, were married again, in a small quiet ceremony on the same coastal stretch of North Carolina where Naomi had rebuilt her life from nothing, with Eli as an exceptionally proud ring bearer and Grace, radiant in a white dress she had chosen herself, insisting on walking down the aisle scattering flower petals with the theatrical seriousness only a 6-year-old could bring to the job. Naomi still works at Ashworth Regional, now as chief of trauma medicine, Still occasionally the person standing over a crash cart calling out orders that mean the difference between a family's worst day and their most tragic one. Adrian, for his part, restructured Cole Ventures to allow him to work primarily from North Carolina, unwilling, after everything, to ever again build a life that required choosing between the empire and the family standing in front of him. Sometimes, in the quiet of an evening with both children finally asleep, Naomi will find Adrian standing in the doorway of Grace's room, watching her sleep with an expression that carries the specific weight of a man calculating, again and again, everything 6 stolen years cost him, and everything he has finally fully reclaimed. "Do you ever think about how differently this could have gone?" she asked him once, finding him there. "If Eli hadn't been in that accident. If we'd never ended up in the same hospital at all." Adrian was quiet for a long moment, watching his daughter's chest rise and fall in the soft glow of a nightlight shaped like a moon. "Every day," he said finally. "But I try not to live in that version. I try to live in this one. The one where my son's accident, the worst day of my life, turned out to be the exact door that let me back into the family I never should have lost in the first place." Naomi leaned against the doorframe beside him, and for a long moment, they simply stood together, watching their daughter sleep, 2 people who had lost 6 years to a lie neither of them had built, and who had found their way, against every impossible odd, back to each other, and to a family that had somehow, through the cruelest possible circumstance, finally been made whole.